Hello folks, the next lesson, the gun really is going to be the star. The action is going to be around the action of the revolver, and if you see me it'll be by accident or just my hands. We're going to incorporate a little bit of a history lesson in this. I have 4 revolvers laid out on the table, and I'm going to introduce you to them one by one. First one is going to be this one. This is basically an 1860 Civil War era cap and ball revolver. I'll explain what cap and ball means in a little moment. It's quite heavy and it's pretty long. The barrel is a good 8.5 to 9 inches long, which would make it accurate, but also not very concealable. A lot of the parts are the same though as a modern revolver. There's a lot of commonality. So just to go through them, the barrel, this being the tube that the bullet passes down. You've got a front sight, sits at the end of the barrel, the far end. You got the rear sight, which is close to the hammer. You got the top strap, which is this part of the revolver above the cylinder. You have the hammer itself, and the hammer has a hammer spur, and it is the hammer spur that allows you to cock the hammer. The cylinder, when you cock the hammer, the cylinder rotates, comes into position. Now this does not have a cylinder thumb latch, that comes in later versions, but I'll explain that as we go, or a cylinder star. Doesn't have an extractor rod, but it does have a trigger. So when it is cocked, it is ready for the trigger to be pulled, and the trigger performs just one single action, which is to allow the hammer to fall. Hence the expression, a single action. The trigger is surrounded by a trigger guard to stop you accidentally setting the trigger off. You have to do a deliberate act and finger the trigger, which is something we should have talked about at other parts in the lesson. And so that you can hold it, it has a grip, this being the grip. And the grip has a back strap, which is the portion of metal to the rear, and a front strap, which is the portion of metal to the front. And in between those two, covered by the grips, you have a main spring and the workings of the pistol, which is what gives the hammer the energy to fire forward whenever you pull the trigger. Now, I mentioned earlier that it is a cap and ball revolver. It is so called because to load this, you put it on half cock, you turn it so the barrel's pointing upwards. You would put in a charge of powder from your powder flask, which will go down into one of the recesses in the cylinder. You would set on that a ball, being a lead ball. You would rotate that onto this lever, and you would work the lever to push the ball down into the cylinder so that it is firmly seated. Then you would repeat that action 5 or 6 times until you have loaded all your chambers, or all but one, which was common practice back in the day. You kept the hammer down on your unloaded cylinder, and that prevented any accidental discharges by the hammer getting struck. And that was a safety feature of revolvers of that time, that you just didn't load them with 6 unless you knew you were going into combat or a shootout. So you load the cylinders, you've got the gunpowder in there, you've got a ball sitting on top. A lot of times after that they would put lard or some other sealant over the cylinders so that you wouldn't get a chain fire. A chain fire is where the explosion of the cylinder sets off an adjoining cylinder, which then fires and the ball shoots out, which can be a little unpleasant. I have experienced it once and always made sure I put plenty of lard on so I didn't experience it again. So you load up the cap and ball. Again, you have it on half cock, which allows you to rotate the cylinder. And at that point then you can put the primer caps over the nipples. The nipples are what you can see from the business end here. So you would put on your 5 or 6 primer caps, and then that's the gun loaded and ready to go. And that's probably the origin of the expression to bust a cap. When you bust the primer cap, it detonates the charge inside the cylinder, which forces the ball out the barrel, and that's your gun shooting. Now I have a YouTube video on the Irish Paul Firearms training site of this actual gun being fired by a friend of mine. And when you fired an old black powder gun, it generated a lot of smoke. And one can only imagine the smoke and confusion on the battlefield when that was taking place. But the cap and ball revolver, 1860, tried and tested weapon, and plenty of them still out there today, modern reproductions. A lot of fun to shoot, but very time consuming, takes a long time to load them, and you can see why designs moved on. So historically, we'll move forward a bit. This is a Webley 38. Now the Webley 38 is interesting to me because these were still being carried by the police back in Northern Ireland well up into the late 1970s. They're a World War II design. They were brought into existence around about 1932, in between the First World War and the Second World War, based on the earlier Webley design, which is the brake type. You push down the lever, you pull down the barrel, and the chamber is exposed. Now when you do that, it raises the star in the middle of the cylinder. You should be able to see that there. And that lifts the brass cases out, and that allows you to eject your empties, which is primarily what that is for quick reloading. And then you would drop in your next 6, close up, and you're ready for action. Now, difference in this design, this actually is a double action. So you can cock the hammer and pull the trigger, boom, and that's a single action, or you can pull the trigger and it cocks the hammer and releases it, and that's firing double action. Now it also rotates the cylinder. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and your gun's empty. Break it open, eject the cases, reload and repeat. So that's the design. The original design for these was from the late 1800s, probably 1896 or thereabouts. The earlier version of this Webley, the 455 Mark VI, was known as the Boer War version, but that design was in service with the British. Smith & Wesson had a similar brake top design, the Schofield revolver. That's very similar characteristics, although I believe it was not double action, it was single action. So this saw service 2 world wars, the older version, the 455 in the First World War, this version in the Second World War, and there's probably still a few of them kicking around parts of the world even now. It uses the 38 Smith & Wesson cartridge, which is a little weak by modern standards, but the British powers that be decided that it was going to be adequate with a 200 grain bullet. It was going to be adequate for wartime use. So when we go over the parts, the barrel that the bullet makes its way down, the foresight, the backside, the cylinder, trigger guard, trigger, grips, front strap, back strap, top strap, all these parts are very similar. The only difference with this, between this and a more modern design, is the way that the frame actually breaks open, because that's not typical of most of what you'd see in revolvers nowadays. This design has sort of gone out of favour in many respects. But nice little bit of history. They were still kicking around whenever I was a young policeman. People who could not handle a Walther PPK very often were given one of these because they were fairly simple and fairly idiot proof. Moving on. This is a Ruger Speed 6. Now, I actually carried one of these as a young police officer for over 20 years. It has the more typical, more modern design of the thumb release. So you push this with your right thumb and the cylinder pushes out with your left hand, and that allows you to manipulate the cylinders with your left hand. So when you're loading, you can drop the rounds in. And again, in the advice, it says point the barrel down at 45 degrees when you're loading, and then gravity will assist you when you're actually putting the rounds into the gun. If you try to do it at a different angle, you may find they'll not stay in very well. Close it up, gun will be ready to shoot. It's loaded with live ammunition, so I'm not going to shoot it in the classroom. That's something we keep for the range. But to get those rounds out of there, you hold the gun in your weak hand, typically your left hand, push the cylinder open, holding down the thumb release, and then you use the ejector rod to push the rounds out while you tip the barrel up. And that's typically how a more modern revolver works. The chamber swings out to the side, almost invariably. It's out to the left side. So you push the release, the barrel swings out to the side, tip it up, knock out your empties, and you're good to go. Now, we've shown that it's clear, so we can demonstrate the mechanism. Like the Webley, like the 1860 Remington, you can cock it and fire in a single action manner, or also like the Webley, you can squeeze the trigger and it'll fire double action. Now, difference between single action and double action, the trigger effort is a lot greater on double action. On single action, typically it doesn't take much pressure, so that's better for accuracy. Double action is for when you're rapidly bringing it into service. But if you learn and practice and build up your trigger finger muscles, you can still be accurate on double action. Common features still there: front sight, back sight, the barrel, cylinder, but this one has the thumb release, the ejector rod, and the ejector star, which you see pops up to push the empty cases out. On this one, because the rubber grips go the whole way around, you can't see the front strap and the back strap of the grip. The grips totally enclose them, but that's fine, you know they're there. That's part of the structural integrity of the gun. So, Ruger Speed 6, 1972 they first started making these, but this basic design has been around a lot longer, and this still is how most revolvers are configured. If you go to the gun shop today, most revolvers are going to look very, very similar to this, and they're going to be single action, double action with a hammer and a hammer spur. So that's a gun. A little bit of history to me. Been around for a long time. It's a heavy gun. It's designed for the 357 cartridge, and very strong, very robust, very, very rugged gun. It's got fixed sights. There's no convenient way to adjust them. So if your gun's shooting a little bit off, you just need to learn and use Kentucky windage to adjust. So the Ruger Speed 6 revolver, single action, double action, typical of modern designs that you will see to this day. Last but not least, a Smith & Wesson Model 442 Airweight. Now, difference between this and the Ruger is it's got front sight, back sight, barrel, top strap. Like the Ruger, well, unlike the Ruger, the back strap is exposed, but the front strap is covered by the grip. So you know you've got a back strap, piece of metal running down here, but the rubber grips enclose it to the front. Has the thumb release and you push out the cylinder, just the same as the Ruger, and just the same as the Ruger, it has the ejector rod and the star which pushes the rounds out. Now this is chambered only for 5 rounds rather than 6. Part of the reason for that is this is the kind of revolver that is purposely designed for concealed carry. Now it's narrower. If I put it side by side with the Ruger, you may be able to see that it profiles just a bit narrower, and when you're trying to conceal it either in a pocket or tucked in your waistband or whatever, that difference in width can be quite significant. But the other difference is this has no hammer. No hammer spur. The hammer is completely enclosed in the body. And the advantages of that are there's nothing to catch. So if you're bringing it out of a pocket or a pocket book, there's very few sharp edges or anything rough to snag on your clothing or rip the lining of your pocketbook or any of those things. So it's small, it's light, it fires the 38 special cartridge. This one's chambered up to PP, which means that's a slightly more potent 38 special cartridge. I did fire this recently, and I can tell you when you're firing a full 38 special load, 158 grain, you know you're shooting a gun. You do feel a bit of recoil, and typically you'll feel the trigger guard and a little bit of pushback when you're shooting it. But what it is, this is a powerful, effective handgun in a small package that's very reliable. You get your 5 shots, then you got to reload, but those 5 shots are worth having. And pretty concealable, pretty light, pretty simple. At the gun shop, we often recommend these to people for whom racking the slide on a semi-auto is physically difficult. Someone who doesn't have a lot of firearms experience, who doesn't know a whole lot about guns, the revolver has the beauty of simplicity. So you push the thumb release, you bring out the cylinder, you load the rounds in, point it down 45 degrees, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, close it up. Now the gun is perfectly safe, nothing is going to happen unless you, and I took that round out, so don't be afraid there's going to be a bang here. Nothing's going to happen unless you pull the trigger. Now it's double action only. It brings back the hammer, which you can't see because it's completely enclosed, and it drops it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's bang, 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 and then you're done. You need a reload. The police department in New York used to be officers, detectives in particular, would carry more than one of these, maybe as many as 3 or 4 revolvers. And when they emptied one, they'd throw it away and pull another one out, and that was known as a New York reload. That's fine if you have those kind of resources. Where I came from, they only gave you one gun and that was it. So you had to learn to reload as best you could. So that's the lesson on the revolver. The couple of little extra points. On some revolvers, the cylinders rotate clockwise. On some others, they rotate counterclockwise. I'll not go into all the different marks and brands and all the rest of it. The only thing you need to know is your revolver, get familiar with it, and be sure you know which way the cylinder rotates on it. And I've already covered when you're unloading, tip the barrel up, you empty the shells out, and that way you get gravity working for you, and the opposite's true when you're putting them in. Basically that's it. To check that a revolver is clear, and we'll be repeating this throughout the course. You pick it up, open the cylinder, make sure there's nothing in there. When you've satisfied yourself that there's nothing there, close it up. You know the gun is clear. You have proved that it is clear. We call that proving the weapon. That's the same for most modern revolvers. For the Webley, obviously you would break it open. The black powder is a different story. The black powder, basically you would have to look into the chambers, but we're not going to dwell on that because that's not a concealed carry gun. So there you are, that's the lesson on the revolver. I've made this video so that I don't have to have 4 revolvers kicking around the classroom every time we do a class. But hopefully that's clear, and the revolver does confer various advantages, but one of the biggest advantages to my mind just is the mechanical simplicity. Revolvers typically do not have safety catches, so that's one less thing you have to forget and worry about. And there's a lot to be said for a gun that you can just pull out of a pocketbook or a pocket and it's ready to go. One other little point, the sight radius, just to go back to the first one. The sight radius on the old school one is really far. The back sight's here and the front sight's there, and that's probably a good 8 inches apart. So that means when you would be aiming this gun, you should be able to get it really on target. It's nearly like a rifle in terms of the distance between the front sight and the back sight. When you come down to the air weight, the difference between the front sight and the back sight is only about 3 inches, so your sight radius is less than half. That just means with a short barrel, it requires a bit of skill and effort to line it up as effectively. So really these guns are a little tricky to shoot once you get out past about 15-20 yards, unless you're really experienced. The other side of that coin is if you get someone who really knows what they're doing. I've seen a video of Jerry McCluck shooting a balloon at 200 yards with a gun just like this. Now to my mind that's supernatural. No normal human being can do that. But these guns typically, a lot of people come into the gun store and say, I bought a little revolver and I can't hit anything with it. Well, that's probably because they don't have the trigger control and the skills and the experience to shoot it accurately at distance. But most encounters don't take place at distance, they take place at very close ranges. And at very close ranges, this kind of simple gun is very, very effective. And for the less experienced user, I would definitely say it's well worth considering. So here endeth the lesson on revolvers. Next lesson will be semi-auto pistols. Have a good one.